Hello! There are many videos out there discussing Pokemon's type balance. Every Pokemon YouTuber under the sun has probably talked about it at some point. I'm however not a Pokemon YouTuber. I focus on game design. While I do personally play on Showdown myself, which I'm also using for background footage here, I'm not going to be analysing it from a competitive standpoint. Today, I will be looking at the Pokemon type balance from the perspective of a game designer. From the thumbnail, you probably already know where this is going. Normal is the worst type in all of Pokemon. But why though? Well, let's get into it. But before that, it is imperative that you like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks! Obviously, context is very important because Pokemon is played in many forms. The single player experience, Smogon 6v6 singles, the official VGC doubles format, and custom player imposed challenges such as Nuzlocke. Today, I'll be focusing on Smogon 6v6 singles. And I chose this format because there's plenty of data out there, and I play that myself, and in my opinion it's also the closest competitive experience to the single player Pokemon games. For those of you who know what Smogon is, feel free to skip to the timestamp shown here. What is Smogon? Smogon is a fan community that organizes competitive Pokemon battling, with a usage-based tiering system. Pokemon are grouped into tiers based on how often they are used in competitive battles. The most active tier is called Overuse, or OU for short, where the strongest Pokemon get used the most. Of course, unless they're too strong, such as powerful box legendaries, in that case they are played in a tier called Ubers instead. If a Pokemon isn't used enough in OU by the player base, it drops down to Underuse, or UU for short. And then rarely used, RU, never used, NU, and then poorly used, PU, and then finally the last tier, Zero Use, ZU. Each tier is its own metagame format where players can use Pokemon from that tier or below. Think of it kinda like weight classes. With modern metagames available, it allows for weaker Pokemon to still have a competitive environment of its own instead of being overshadowed by stronger ones. For example, Slowbro is not competitively viable to be consistently used in OU, but in RU, it's a top tier mon. The usage data is based on thousands of battles played on Pokemon Showdown, the online battle simulator, and the tiers are updated from time to time based on those numbers. Over time, Pokemon can rise up and fall between the tiers. Basically, players are kinda self-balancing the game themselves, because, ideally, most players are playing to win, and they will use the Pokemon that can give them the best chance of doing so. There's also something called ban lists as well. So for example, if a Pokemon is too strong for a tier, but it doesn't have enough usage for the tier above, it is in the ban list. Garchomp is too strong for UU, but it's not used enough to be considered OU by usage rates. So it's stuck in UUBL, the ban list of UU. For simplicity's sake, all ban list Pokemon will be considered for their legal tier for this video. For example, all UUBL Pokemon will be considered OU. Let's look at some numbers. As a game designer, making Excel sheets and comparing numbers is one of my favorite things to do. And it's not just for fun. By doing this, you can help paint a better picture of mechanics you're trying to balance or design. The first thing I want to know is, for each type, what percentage of all Pokemon of that type are in OU? Let me explain. If there are 38 fully evolved Ghost-type Pokemon, and let's say 5 of them are in OU, that means 13.16 of Ghost types are in OU. I went through Smogon and counted every single fully evolved Pokemon in each usage tier, excluding alternate forms that do not affect gameplay, such as Sinistcha and its Sinistcha Masterpiece form. So here are the results. On average, any given type should have about 12.47% of its Pokemon in OU. So if a type is above that number, then it's overperforming, it's better than the average. If it's below, that means it's underperforming. There are 11 types that are above average and 7 types below average in OU. The top 3 in percentage by type are Dark with 19.57%, and then the Ground type with 19.44%, and in third place, it's Dragon with 19.05%. The Dark type is surprisingly the Dark Horse, being the best type in OU, outshining the types such as Fairy, Steel, or Ground, which are generally perceived as really strong types. The Bug, Normal, and Ice types tend to be perceived as weaker types, and unsurprisingly, are in fact weak. It is especially unfortunate for the Bug type with literally 0 Bug type mons in OU, and yes, I know Volcarona is banned to Ubers, but it's not really the point of this video. There were also surprisingly fewer steel types than expected. Only 15.79% of steel types are in OU. The same with another strong type, water, only 11.43%. Keep in mind that this is a relatively small sample size, and there are only so many slots in OU available, so these numbers can be skewed by just a few Pokemon. And if you're curious, I will link all the spreadsheets below so you can check it out yourself. Next, I looked at the opposite extreme, Zero Use, which is shortened to ZU. ZU is the lowest tier, and it's also the biggest. It's the last funnel in the competitive tiering system. Every mon that is not good enough to make it up at OU, UU, RU, NU, and PU end up in ZU. So, what's the type distribution for ZU? There you go. Here, for a type to be considered good or strong, you want a low number instead. On average, any given type should have about 33.58% of its Pokemon in ZU. Dragon is first place by a much lower margin with only 7.14% of Dragon types in ZU. Steel is in second place with 15.79% and Fairy is third at 18.18%. Dark is actually not doing too well compared to its good showing in OU. It's a very mid type, only being the 9th best. Ice, Grass, Electric, and Normal are doing the worst. All these types at least have half of their Pokemon in ZU. So, more likely than not, if you throw a rock at a random Pokemon of these types, they are weak Pokemon in competitive battling, residing in ZU. Now, I think looking at ZU might actually give a clearer view of a type's viability, since the sample size is so much bigger here. For example, outliers like Rock type in OU, which is usually a pretty low tier type, but because it's carried by certain Pokemon with really good move pool, stats, or abilities, they're kinda exposed here as mid, with 48% of Rock types being in ZU. Next, I wanted a way to measure the overall type strength across the entire tier system, not just OU or ZU. So, I assigned some imaginary points to each tier and score the types accordingly. Pokemon in Ubers get 4 points, Pokemon in OU get 3.5, UU gets 3, and so on and so forth, all the way down to ZU, which gets 1 point. Then, I calculated the average score for each type. So here's an example. If a type has half of its bonds in Ubers and half in ZU, the score will naturally be 2.5. If a type has many of its mons in higher tiers, it will have a higher score, and vice versa. To make it a little more fair, since some types have much higher base stats than others, for example dragons, because many of them are like pseudo-legendaries or legendary Pokemons. So to correct for that, I normalized the scores using each type's average base stat total. And here are the results. This chart very much aligns with the ZU chart. Dragon, Steel, Fairy being the top 3, and Grass, Electric, Normal being the 3 worst. Aside from the fact that Dragon is on top, this ranking actually lines up pretty well with general competitive sentiment. The Steel, Fairy, Ghost, Ground, Water, all really good types. Psychic, Bug, Ice, Rock, Grass, Electric, Normal, weak types. Shout out to the Bug type for coming in 13th place, despite the Game Freak designers wanting it to be a bad type. Good job, Bug types. I also want to specifically mention the Poison type. In the scoring, it is in 10th place. In ZU placement, it is 8th. So, that means that overall the type is weaker, but there are many of them in lower tiers that are not in ZU. In fact, it has the biggest share of a type in NU, the 4th tier, and it's the second most in PU, the 5th tier. Why is this relevant, you might ask? Well, it would all make sense when I talk about it in the numbers part 3 section of this video. Anyway, let's finally do a little experiment, and this time it will be based on a GDC talk by Alex Jeffy on metagame balance, which I will link somewhere in the description. Forget about Pokemon for a moment. Let's say we are playing rock, paper, scissors. How can we make a matchup chart of rock, paper, and scissors? Here we go. Rock ties with rock, rock loses to paper, and rock defeats scissors. So let's say I'm playing against someone else, and I want to achieve the best possible win rate, and they are also doing the same. What is the optimal strategy I should do? How much of each rock, paper, and scissors should I play? Using linear programming, which is a mathematical optimization method, I can compute the best possible strategy for this scenario. I'm gonna be fully honest here, I don't really get all the maths myself. I mostly just plug the numbers into some code. But like Alex mentions in the GDC video, You don't really need to understand the process, just the results. And the results are pretty intuitive in my opinion. Our best strategy is a mixed strategy that we should play each rock, paper and scissors 1/3 of the time. By doing so, no matter what the opponent chooses, our expected win rate is exactly 50%. The smart people among you might have already noticed that, hey, we can easily replace rock, paper and scissors with grass, fire and water, since their matchup relationships are identical. Grass ties with itself, it loses to fire, and it beats water. And since the structure is the same, obviously the optimal strategy is also identical. We should always play grass, fire and water each 1/3 of the time. This experiment basically reduces Pokemon to what game designers call a selection game, where I'm just choosing a type instead of battling. If I choose fire and you choose grass, I win 100% of the time. The matchup determines the outcome entirely. Okay, let's switch it up. Let's replace water with ice. How does it affect our matchup game? In this example, ice will have a 75% win rate against grass, since it is super effective against grass but doesn't resist grass itself. Fire does well offensively and defensively against grass types, so it gets a 100% win rate. Since ice has a 75% win rate against grass, naturally, grass has a 25% win rate against ice. Now let's run the linear program again. The optimal strategy has now changed. Now it is always optimum to play fire. There's literally no better outcome from playing anything else. The result is a Nash equilibrium, a concept in game theory. In simple terms, it means that a state where no other player can improve their outcome by switching up their strategy. There is literally no downside to choosing fire, so everyone will just choose fire. I've simplified a lot, so I will also just link a video explaining Nash equilibrium better than I ever could. Regardless of game theory, obviously this is a bad outcome, because every game would just be fire versus fire. Every other strategy is now obsolete. And that's pretty bad from a game design standpoint. What if we replace grass with ground instead? You might look at the numbers and think, fire probably still does the best. But no, remember, the other player is playing against you as well, and is also trying to maximize their win rate. So when we plug it in into the linear program, the optimal strategy is now a mixed strategy again, unlike the previous. The solver tells us that we should play ground 50% of the time, fire 25%, and ice 25%. In this type trio, ground kinda acts as the main counterbalance in this system. It keeps fire types from becoming overly dominant. Remember, the linear program always just tries to choose probabilities that make all of the opponent's strategies equally bad at beating you, and you are playing an opponent that is doing the exact same thing as you. Now, after seeing all these mini type charts, you obviously want to see the results of the real type chart. I painstakingly filled out the type matrix for all 18 types, and now we have an 18 by 18 matrix that describes the entire type interaction system. For simplicity's sake, immunities are treated the same as resistances here. And just for funsies, I also added the score column to give you a rough idea of how strong a type is across all matchups. So, drum roll please! To achieve a balance in the Pokemon type selection game, here are the distribution of types needed. Steel, Dragon, Water, Grass and Ground types are in the top 5 with more than 10% usage. 6 types are completely irrelevant here, and Ice type has a funny 0.5% usage. I will share the Python code somewhere in the description and you can play around yourself. Keep in mind that this, again, is not Pokemon, it's a type selection game, and dual types also don't exist. The usage rate of the types here reflects the importance of the type in balancing the type matchup game, and sometimes it does correlate to the actual strength of the type. And unsurprisingly, Steel is a very important type here, with a play rate of 14.71%. And it makes sense, as Game Freak kinda did add Steel type as a fix to Generation 1's type chart. It has a ton of defensive resistances, giving it a positive matchup against many types in the metagame. Dragon, again the surprise package so far, shares very similar traits, as it has many positive matchups itself. Shockingly, the Grass type is really high up there. I guess Grass does help keep Water and Ground in check, and both of those types are really powerful types in the chart. Without Grass keeping them humbled, Water and Ground might become much harder to punish and potentially dominate the matchup game. When balancing as a game designer, we must always remember, sometimes a strategy is not important because it's strong or it wins a lot, but because it prevents other strategies from becoming overly dominant. And it's actually a really interesting way to balance something, in my opinion. Having the weak counter the strong can create really interesting game balance. As you can see, there are 6 irrelevant types here: fighting, psychic, ghost, poison, normal, and bug types. They are considered the always excluded strategies. In this model, if another strategy performs equally as good in every matchup, and even better in some, it completely invalidates these types. They don't provide any unique balancing role that isn't already handled by other types. The most obvious obsolete type is normal, since it hits nothing super effectively and it can easily be replaced by other types. It never actually has a positive matchup in the model, since the best it can get is only 50% win rate. So in a type matchup game, normal type will always be at 0%. Let's look at an actual viable type in real Pokemon battles: the Ghost type. Remember, this isn't Pokemon battles, it's type selection game. Ghost type's strength is that it hits many things for neutral damage, and due to its 2 immunities, it can switch in very easily. Just like normal type, neutral damage isn't beneficial in this model, and it only hits itself and psychic for super effective damage, and both of them are at 0% in this model. It resists poison, bug, and is immune to fight and normal, and guess what? All of them are irrelevant here. Another really good typing, poison. In Pokemon games, poison is one of the best defensive typings with 5 resistances. However, in this model, Steel completely outshines poison, as it takes its job as the fairy answer while also being resistant to all types that poison types are resistant to, except for fighting. But the model also removes fighting types from the equation, robbing poison types of its one advantage over steel types. What if steel types never happened? In this world where humans never made steel, the type selection game is also affected. Like I've mentioned before, steel makes poison obsolete. If I set steel to be kept at 0% in the linear program, voila! Poison becomes the second most optimum type at 14.32%. Do you remember in the previous section where I mentioned that poison's prevalence in the 4th and 5th tier? Well, since the high tiers take up all the good steel types, like it's actually quite insane. Ubers and the top 3 tiers combined take up 71% of all steel types. So in the lower tiers, there is a need of defensive backbones, and poisons are a good fit, as they counter fairies, a powerful type, and, as I've mentioned before, they have very good resistances. In this world where steel doesn't exist, ice also becomes a much stronger type, and due to that, dragon and grass types suffer because of their bad matchup against the ice type. One of the best types out there, the water type, remains great, as it becomes the next best all-rounder, filling in the gaps left by the steel type. Rock, however, interestingly becomes almost obsolete, only with 0.58% left. Steel was its adversary, but now it's gone. While water obviously has advantages against rock, you would think that with rock's advantage over poison and ice, it would still stay as one of the good types, but no. I think this really shows the benefit of using the linear program. With it, we can better see how changes can potentially affect a metagame's balance, rather than just eyeballing it. Now, just for fun, let's also simulate the 2 other type charts that have existed in Pokemon's history. Generation 2 to 5, before the introduction of fairies, and also Generation 1, where Steel and Dark didn't exist. Before fairy types existed, dragons were the supreme type in Pokemon. And, unsurprisingly, it is the same in selection game. Due to their dominance with 30%, Steel is also top tier, with 20%. It is quite crazy that before fairies, 50% of the optimum strategy is to play Steel or Dragon. In this selection game also, a whopping 10 types are obsolete, which is more than half of the types. Only Dragon, Steel, Water, Ground, Flying, Fighting, and Electric remain relevant. Such a centralizing meta is obviously unideal. Now let's say we restrict Dragon types to 10%. What happens then? Instead of 10 obsolete types, only 6 types remain obsolete. Dark, Rock, Ice, and Grass types regain relevance. Game Freak can't magically restrict the type, so they went for the other option, switching up the type chart. I applaud the Game Freak devs for once. They recognize that dragons were pretty bullshit, and they decided to make a hard counter for them by making the fairy type. Now, if only they didn't make it resist bug. How about the type chart that was made before I was born? Here is the type selection game based on Generation 1's type chart. If you know anything about competitive Generation 1, is that normal types reign supreme, with Chansey, Tauros, and Snorlax dominating the metagame. Now remember what I said about normal types. It is not good in this context, again because the best it can do is always just 50% win rate. So Dragon type is actually pretty good. Psychic is unsurprisingly also very strong. Funnily enough, Bug, the only type good against Psychic, would have shown as well. So let's make a conclusion based on all the numbers we've seen so far. In OU, the best performing types are Dark, Ground, Dragon. The worst performing 3 are Ice, Normal, and Bug. And in ZU, the best performing 3 types are Dragon, Steel, and Fairy, and the worst are Grass, Electric, and Normal. The top 3 in the scoring chart and the bottom 3 in the scoring chart is exactly the same as ZU. And for the matchup game ranking, the best performing 3 is Steel, Dragon, and Water, while the worst performing 6, all tied, are Bug, Fighting, Ghost, Normal, Poison, and Psychic types. So it seems that Steel and Dragon seem to be both the top tier types according to all the data so far. But I personally don't think I would want to focus on what's the best type here. I want to instead talk about what I consider to be the worst type in Pokemon. Like I've mentioned at the start of the video, and also from the thumbnail, and as you can see all of its bad showing so far, the normal type is the worst type in Pokemon. From a competitive standpoint, the normal type feels pretty bad. The only contribution it has to a metagame is its immunity to ghost types. A metagame can have 0 normal types and function perfectly in my opinion. It doesn't really contribute to the game's balance, and it also doesn't counter any types in meaningful ways. While I'm not saying that we should make the type chart perfectly balanced, like how it is in Rock Paper Scissors, but types that are considered weak, like Grass, serves a function. Ignoring the qualities such as powder immunity or move pool or even abilities, Grass, even with its 5 weaknesses and 7 types resisting Grass offensively, it is important due to it countering the 2 premier types as mentioned before, Ground and Water. In the single-player RPG game, normal types kinda serve as the generic creatures, something you find early on and they tend to be weak, encouraging the player to take them out of the party after they get the cooler late-game types, like Fire, Ghost, Dark, Dragon types. It is similar to the Bark type, but at least when they designed the Bark type, they decided to throw a bone to them. They gave Bark type resistances to both ground and fighting, providing something unique to the balance of the game. So, if I were a game designer at Game Freak, I'd either add a new type or tweak the current type chart to improve the normal type. Just please give it something, an identity, a metagame purpose that no other type can easily replace. Please. To conclude, even if you don't care about competitive Pokemon, I think the design analysis methods I've shown, from collecting stats in Excel to using a matchup matrix and linear program for game balancing, all these are widely applicable to game design. You can model any game's type-like interactions, for example hero counters in a MOBA, classes in a tactics game, or even matchups in a fighting game, like the original GDC video, which I strongly suggest you watch that video if you hadn't already. It helps you balance overpowered classes and types, and potentially find gaps or redundancies in your balancing. And it even lets you test how small changes to interactions can ripple through a system, like when I turned off steel types. Keep in mind though, that these numbers are just a starting point. It gives you a way to quantify balance and identify which mechanics are useful, redundant, or over-centralizing. But player perception is also a very important thing. The player doesn't see your spreadsheet. They themselves need to feel that the type or options presented in the game has a clear identity and purpose, and feel balanced. While Pokemon is very flawed from a game design standpoint, I still think the type chart is very well designed for the most part. Steel being so overpowered in defense create opportunities for types that counter it, such as Fire, Fight, and Ground, and the Fighting and Ground types being good gives the weak Bug type a valuable role in the game's balance, and I find such interactions very interesting. But yeah, anyway, my conclusion is that the normal type sucks. And I really hope that Game Freak will fix it in the next gen, but I doubt that'll ever happen. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. What do you think is the strongest type? And what do you think is the weakest? Do you agree with normal type being the worst? And that's it for today. If you made it so far, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please consider subscribing to the channel. Bye bye!